How much of Latin America DNA shows ancient indigenous adaptations and how much shows new post-colonial evolution? Before Europeans arrived, indigenous communities across the Americas had already been adapting for thousands of years. Their DNA carried traits that helped them handle strong sunlight, high-altitude air, and traditional diets. Then, in the 15th century, Europeans and Africans came to the Americas, and for the first time, these very different gene pools mixed. That mixing brought brand new challenges, like exposure to smallpox and changes in food sources and lifestyle. Mendoza and her team had three main ideas they wanted to test. First, they wanted to see if there were still signs of those ancient indigenous adaptations in modern genomes. Second, that natural selection kicked back in after colonization, shaping that new, mixed DNA to help people survive unfamiliar diseases and environments. And third, that by looking at which ancestry chunks of DNA are more common near certain genes, we can tell which adaptations are ancient and which are recent. What makes this study so interesting is that it gives us two timelines of evolution, one from long before European contact and another that's been unfolding over just the past few hundred years. The researchers broke their work into three main steps. First included populations and data. They analyzed about 1,000 people from Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Puerto Rico. Each person's DNA is a mix of indigenous, European, and African ancestry, which makes Latin American genomes perfect for studying how evolution acts on blended populations. Secondly, they use locally ancestry mapping. They use computer software called RFMix to label every small piece of each person's genome by its origin. So you can imagine the genome as a long strip colored orange for indigenous, blue for European, and green for African, like a mosaic. Third was detecting selection. They scanned the genome to find regions where one ancestry color showed up more often than expected. When a certain ancestry is enriched around a gene, that usually means natural selection favored that ancestry's version of the gene. They then identified which gene these hotspots belonged to and compared them across populations to see whether that signal reflected ancient indigenous adaptation or new post-colonial selection after admixture. These three steps together let them connect ancestry patterns with real evolutionary changes happening across different time periods. It focuses on the ancient part of the story, how indigenous populations in the Americas had already adapted to their local environments long before Europeans arrived. Figure 2b here shows where indigenous ancestry is overrepresented across the genome. Each orange peak represents a region where natural selection favored indigenous ancestry, meaning these genes probably helped people survive in the Americas thousands of years ago. Some of the strongest peaks line up with well-known genes. The first is the OCA2 and SLC2485, both linked to skin pigmentation. These variants likely helped balance UV exposure and vitamin D production across different climates. And another big signal appears at EPAS1, a gene that helps people live at high altitudes for improving oxygen use, especially important for alien populations. There's also enrichment around the FADS gene cluster, which affects fatty acid metabolism, probably tied to traditional diets rich in marine foods. So when we look at this figure, those tall orange peaks are snapshots of ancient adaptation, DNA that's been fine-tuned for thousands of years. Altogether, these findings show that indigenous groups had already evolved to meet the demands of their unique environments long before colonization ever began. After colonization, Latin America became one of the most genetically diverse regions on Earth, but it also came with huge new challenges. Europeans and Africans brought new pathogens and foods, so populations suddenly faced diseases like smallpox and malaria, and shifts from traditional diets to European staples like wheat and dairy. The researchers found clear genetic signals showing how people's DNA responded. African ancestry was especially enriched near the HLA region, which contrasts immune defense. Those variants likely provided better resistance to infectious diseases that spread after contact. They also found European ancestry enrichment at several metabolic and inflammation-related genes, possibly reflecting adaptation to new diets and lifestyles. This figure shows the results of the genome-wide selection scan. Each dot is a section of DNA, and the higher the point, the stronger the signal of natural selection favoring that ancestry. The green peaks mark regions where African ancestry is unusually common. One of the biggest is at the HL gene, which helps fight infection. There are also blue peaks for European ancestry, especially near metabolism-related genes. Together, these patterns tell us that after colonization, natural selection favored certain ancestry blocks that help people survive new diseases and diets. What's really striking is that these evolutionary challenges happen with only about 5 centuries, showing how fast natural selection can act when populations mix and face strong environmental. So, why does that all matter? Mendoza and her team show that human evolution in the Americas had two overlapping chapters. The first chapter is ancient, where indigenous people adapted over thousands of years to things like climate, sunlight, altitude, and diet. The second chapter began after colonization, when mixing between indigenous, European, and African populations created totally new genetic combinations and natural selection started acting again. This means gene flow doesn't just blend populations, it can actually fuel new adaptation by bringing together helpful variants from different ancestries. Wait, start over. So why does this all matter? Mendoza and her team show that human evolution in the Americas had two overlapping chapters. The first chapter is ancient, when indigenous people. So why does this all matter? Mendoza and her team show that human evolution in the Americas had two overlapping chapters. The first chapter is ancient, when indigenous people adapted over thousands of years to things like climate, sunlight, altitude, and diet. The second chapter began after colonization, when mixing between indigenous, European, and African populations created totally new genetic combinations, and natural selection started acting again. This means gene flow doesn't just blend populations, it can actually fuel new adaptations by bringing together helpful variants from different ancestries. It also connects to modern health. Some of the new genetic traits that once helped survival might now influence metabolism, skin traits, or immune response in today's Latin American cultures. Overall, this study reminds us that evolution isn't ancient history. It's still happening, and we can see written right in our genomes. Thanks for listening. Here is the article.